here we are, my second Virtual Stampex talk. My first talk, which some of you may have seen, was regarding forgeries from classic to modern, and I believe it was quite a fairly popular one as well from the feedback I got. And I was humbled to receive the invitation to return to Virtual Stampex for a second time and give another talk. After much deliberation, I decided on an area of philately, which I think is personally quite interesting, and that is stamps being prepared for use but never issued. And many of these stamps have quite an exciting and often controversial story behind them as to reason why they were never issued to post offices up and down their respective countries. And moreover, we're going to be looking into other reasons why they weren't issued, some of them being for practical reasons, as some of them are listed here. Some of them are due to changing postal rates. Some of them are due to an error of design. A lot of that's sort of already covered. Some of them are due to political happenings, which is often a big feature as to why many stamps were prepared for use and never issued, and other controversies surrounding designs, or simply the passing of a monarch. And carrying on from this, we will look at whatever became of these stamps. How did they survive? And some of those are quite fun stories in themselves. And then we shall look at how valuable some of these stamps are. Some of them are worth some hundreds of pounds, and some of them rock up into the hundreds of thousands of pounds. And so we will gather all sorts of thoughts on those, and then we will carry on and go on to the first aspect of the talk, which is going to be covering the change of monarch. One logical reason why a stamp is prepared for use and then subsequently not issued is due to a change of monarch. With the death of a monarch comes great change, not just simply in the transferring of the crown from one person to another. Lots of changes happen in iconography, and that is the imagery of a monarch. And that is, of course, including their cipher, which for the current king, that is CR3, standing for Charles III, and of course the R standing for Rex, meaning the Latin for king. So that's an imagery that changes, and of course the changes also are pictorial, so they cover the change of coinage and banknotes, and most importantly, for as far as we are concerned, on stamps. As we saw with the accession of Charles III, there was a gradual visual change from one sovereign to another. Of course, his head now is borne on all British and Commonwealth stamps in place of the late Queen Elizabeth. In 1910, there was another change of monarch, and that was following the death of Edward VII. The crown then passed to King George V. And in 1910, the post office proposed a mono-coloured issue for some of the lower value types, with the first one being for the twopenny. Previously, it had been printed in green and carmine, and bicoloured plates are slightly more expensive. So the idea to have a mono-coloured plate made a lot more economical sense. And so many proofs and trials were prepared and redesigned, and a new colour which was decided upon is Tyrian plum. Now, Tyrian plum is a very ancient colour in a way. It's the colour that the ancient Romans used to dye their robes, and the Byzantine emperors also did. So purple is seen very much as a royal colour. And if any of you knows where Tyrian comes from, it's actually the secretions of a dried up sneeze snail. So it's pretty disgusting stuff, hence why it's very expensive. And they still do make it to this day, actually. Albeit you have to spend quite a lot of money to buy genuine Tyrian pigments. But of course, in 1910, it wasn't so expensive as the industry was much larger, so hence why they could use it all the time. And Tyrian plum is a very vibrant color, as you can see here from the illustration of the stamp here. So, of course, the colour was decided upon, and then the stamps were put to press. Over 100,000 sheets were printed and delivered to the Inland Revenue for release to post offices across the country once the bicoloured twopenny stocks had begun to become exhausted. However, fate intervened, and on the 6th of May of that year, King Edward VII died. And it was decided, out of a mark of respect for the late sovereign, not to proceed with the issuing of the new twopenny stamps, and the whole stock was destroyed. Incredibly, however, a few examples managed to survive the mass burning, and that's a feature we'll come across going forward in these stamps, that some managed to survive and then slowly reach their way onto the market. I had also heard a story that one of these was found in a mixed lot in an auction house in the mid-90s. So it's amazing where these sort of things can come from. Some examples of the stamps are met with specimen overprints, as they were distributed to some UPU member states ready for distribution, and also kept by the printer's archives, and of course the printer, of course, being De La Rue. Only one example is known used, however, and this one example is used on cover. And the one used on cover was addressed to Prince of Wales, who would later, upon the next day, become King George V, and is postmarked the 5th of May, the day before the King's death. The cover is now held in the Royal Philatelic Collection, and there are some images online that you can have a look at and see. Of course, I couldn't get one for this talk. Two imperforate sheets of the stamp in the sort of proof status and other assorted color trials are also existing on the market and in the Postal Museum, and it's always worth a visit to go and see those. And with regards to the value of the unoverprinted Tyrian plum, it currently catalogues at 70. I'm going to have to pause the talk for a minute. The sensor has decided to turn off. Give me one sec. Um, Sorry about that. The automatic sensor, which does the lights for some reason, decided to turn off, so hopefully it won't turn off for a while longer. But carrying on with the talk, currently in the Great Britain Concise catalogue, the Tyrian plum, unoverprinted, is currently catalogued at £90,000. And it has been some years since one appeared on the market, and it is an incredibly valuable stamp. And whilst, of course, that's quite a simple story, death of one monarch, and of course the changing of the iconography and imagery that happens with the monarch. And of course, in later on in 1910, the first King George V stamps become issued. This next story, however, is slightly more controversial and also involves a little bit of theft as well, but only minor theft. So, of course, carrying on with the change of monarch, the change of monarch is traditionally followed by a death. In 1936, it was partly done by a death, but also it was a result of an abdication. And of course, in 1936, as some of you will know, was the year of the Three Kings, because of course Edward VIII abdicated after the death of King George V, and Edward VIII abdicated in favour to marry his American divorcee, Wallis Simpson. And of course, he was then succeeded by his brother, King George VI. And in 1936, some designs of his stamps were prepared for use, but of course never came to fruition because of his abdication. However, one country did manage to get as far as printing other stamps, other than Great Britain. He only reigned for 325 days, and of course during that time, Great Britain did issue a set of 4 stamps to mark his accession, and other Commonwealth countries likewise prepared a use for his stamps, but never got beyond the proof stage. Australia, as you will see going forward in this talk, did manage to print some stamps. But of course, as you see here, in this block of 6 that are illustrated, only 6 survive. And this is the story of how they survived. In 1936, John Ashe, the printers of Australian stamps, began printing a new tuppeny value depicting the new sovereign and was to be printed in a scarlet ink. And in 1936, Lord Huntingfield, who was Governor General of Victoria, paid a ceremonial visit to Ashe printers to inspect these new stamps, and these new stamps were set to be issued by Christmas. John Ashe then sent Lord Huntingfield a complete sheet of the new stamps as a memento of his visit to the printers. In December 1936, however, the king abdicated and the new stamps issue was curtailed, and the orders were made to destroy the entire issue. John Ashe wrote to Huntingfield requesting that the stamps be returned to him. Lord Huntingfield duly obliged, albeit removing 6 stamps from the sheet. When the part sheet arrived at John Ashe printers, he was a little bit annoyed and therefore wrote to Lord Huntingfield again, imploring him to return the stamps that he had removed from the sheet. Huntingfield, however, was not so forthcoming and replied, inform Ashe that the stamps had been sent to England, though it very doubtful if I could obtain possession. And of course, what he was referring to there is that he sent the 6 stamps to a friend of his, a chap called Lord Vestey. Lord Vestey, the first Lord Vestey, was an up-and-coming, very enthusiastic stamp collector and would go on to amass a great stamp collection, particularly in Australia and in Great Britain. This was later sold in Spank in 2014. Of course, this is where this block of stamps first emerged onto the market. The only 6 surviving examples from all the rest of the sheets of stocks that were destroyed following the king's abdication, and 6 remained. And we're carrying on, and we've got a much better image of the stamp. This is one of the singles, because after it was sold in 2014 for a whopping £200,000, the block by its then owner was split into a block of 4 and 2 singles. And more recently, the block of 4, which was the intact one where it bears Lord Huntingfield's initials, was sold via private treaty in Corran Filler, an auction house based in Switzerland, for 200,000 Swiss francs. And that was in November of last year. So it is still a very valuable item, no matter what currency you're looking at. Another one was sold, another single, that single that was pictured there, sold in an Australian auction house for some tens of thousands of US dollars. And another one of the single stamps that had never been offered before onto the market will be offered by them in November of this coming year, I believe. I think it's coming in either their summer or autumn sale in Corran Filler. So keep a lookout for that one, and I'm sure that one will go for a substantial sum as well. So, of course, we've seen the change of monarch as a result, and the withdrawal of the stamps, and the fact that Lord Huntingfield just refused to send back the other stamps because he'd given them as a gift to Lord VIII. And, of course, the reason why John Ash didn't go any further with Lord Huntingfield was because he didn't really want to upset the establishment and thought it best that he let the matter go quiet, and hence why these stamps were able to come onto the market without any real fuss at all. And I've always liked this particular issue myself. It's a real snapshot of what could have been had Edward VIII not had abdicated, and had this stamp been issued, it probably would have been a very common stamp, and one which I would have seen in my day as a professional philatelist almost every day. In childhood collections, of course, a tuppenny value would have been a basic value, and it would have been as anywhere near as valuable as it is currently. But of course, perhaps in a parallel universe, it was issued, and it would be everywhere. But of course, it isn't. There's only 6 out there, and if you want one, you better start saving. But of course, not all stamps are withdrawn because of the change of a monarch. Some are withdrawn to political controversies and sensitivities as a result of the stamp issues, and one of the earliest recorded examples from the British Commonwealth comes from New Brunswick, which was a province of Canada. In 1858 is where our story begins, 2 years before the stamp was issued, with the appointment of a chap called Charles Connell, who was depicted on the stamp there. Charles Connell was elected to the position of Postmaster General for the province. And he was keen to further trade with America at the time, and so therefore instigated a decimalized currency that could be used by New Brunswick. Much of Canada at the time was still using pounds, shillings, and pence, just like Great Britain, but of course New Brunswick began using a decimal currency, so make it easier to trade with America.
There are more Virtual Stampex talks coming to YouTube. Subscribe to our channel now so you don't miss out.
And in 1860, to accompany the new currency, a set of new stamps were issued, all in the new decimalized cents and dollars currency. However, there was public outcry and accusations of narcissism when the new set of stamps were issued, and it was found that Charles Connell had depicted himself on the 5-cent value. And as you can see there, what would normally be the image of a monarch or a national emblem is actually the Postmaster General himself. Causing quite the controversy, Connell had to quell any unrest as a result of the issue of the stamp, and withdrew all the stamps from sale in post offices, and then offered to purchase all the remaining stocks and have them publicly burned on a massive bonfire in his front garden. After such a display of a burning inferno in his front garden, only a few stamps, again, miraculously managed to survive the flames and are worth considerable value today. One of the stamps was even saved by Connell himself, who gifted it to his son, who kept it in his watch for many years and is hence why known as the pocket watch example. And that one came up in a Seagull sale some years ago, and it's quite a fun story. It didn't do very well being in the pocket watch for all those years, but it is still a wonderful story to have and a stamp, very unique in that sense. A fair few examples did survive outside the pocket watch example, and overall usually command high prices when they appear on the market. And they are, however, several forgeries of the stamp, and I've not handled a genuine one, but I have seen many forgeries of this example. And that's another area to perhaps briefly touch upon, and that is there are a lot of fakes of stamps that were prepared for use and never issued. There's always something to be made when you've got a stamp that no one else has in that regard. And currently, in our Stanley Gibbons Part 1 catalogue, which covers all the British Commonwealth stamps from 1840 to 1970, this stamp is listed as SG5 of New Brunswick and is priced at £10,000. Following on from one controversy to another in North America and the Caribbeans, we now move to the West Indies into Jamaica. This stamp here is one you may not be wholly familiar with, but this is the Jamaica 1921 sixpenny abolition of slavery stamp. It marked the abolition of slavery, the anniversary that happened in 1921. It was prepared for use, but never issued for the following reason. The stamp was printed in red and a dull blue-green ink, and it was printed on two types of watermark paper, the current multi-crown watermark CA paper and the script CA papers. These stamps were printed and shipped out to Jamaica, and many were overprinted specimen, including this example here, for distribution to Universal Postal Union members, as per the convention, so that all other member state countries could know what each other's stamps looked like. And it was estimated that 416,000 stamps were originally printed and shipped out to Jamaica. However, in the early 1920s, there was a lot of issues in Jamaica, particularly in the West Indies as a whole. There was growing discontentment because of the falling of sugar prices, and plantation workers and dockers were becoming riled and were threatening strike action. Lord Leslie Probyn, or Sir Leslie as he was then, was the governor of Jamaica, feared that the stamps were far too controversial for the time and the current political climate and ordered that they be destroyed. Some stocks of the stamps were already sent to the UPU, as aforementioned. However, a block of 4 of each type of watermark variety was sent to the King, King George V, for inclusion in the Royal Philatelic Collection, and only a handful, somehow only a handful, of the unoverprinted examples managed to escape the fiery furnaces of official destruction and end up on the market. Examples overprinted specimen are not that particularly rare. They do come up onto the market from time to time and are generally less than £5,000 in value realizations. However, the unoverprinted examples are considered great rarities of the West Indies, and of which only a handful survive, and these are usually worth some tens of thousands of pounds. So, of course, it just goes to show a good intentioned issue can also be quite controversial. And, of course, if you would like one of these, they do occasionally appear in our auctions and in other auctions in the market. So if you want a specimen example, it's not going to cost you a fortune. The last politically withdrawn stamp from issue is one that I'm not sure many collectors are that familiar with. It's an example from the 1946 omnibus set, which was issued, hence known as the Victory issue, and it was marking the Victory Parade that was held in London on the 8th of June 1946, and the issue, 2 stamps for each colony around the British Empire, were issued. The omnibus set as a whole, excluding the one we're going to talk about, is quite a common set. It's one I see quite a lot, and you can pick up the whole complete set for usually less than 20 quid at times. However, there is one area that is quite obviously absent from the 1946 victory set, and that is the Malayan Union and the Malayan states. In 1946, the Malayan states were reorganized into the Malayan Union, a combination of the federated and unfederated Malay states, and the Strait settlements. It was all combined into one big union. There was relative agreement from the sultans of all the respective areas of the state of the Malayan states, and it was primarily because the British government had forced them into doing so they would face dethronement and have a new, more favourable sultan, more favourable to the British, installed in. And so, of course, the sultans all signed up because while they may not have had much political power, they liked to keep their palaces. However, the union only lasted just under 2 years because of the great lay and public protest against the Malayan Union. And of course, it was then dissolved at the end of 1948 and thus becoming the federated Malayan state once again. The proposed Malay Union victory issue, there were going to be two values. There's going to be the 8-cent carmine and a 15-cent violet. Only the 8-cent carmine survives because, thankfully, someone thought to pull a sheet out of the furnaces as it was being burned. And that brave person, after removing all the very charred stamps from the sheet and preserved the finest examples that he could, quickly then sold them on to dealers and collectors and pocketing the fee himself, though he was caught by authorities, but no one's really quite sure what happened to him. The 8 cents is a scarce stamp, and I have not seen many. And of course, this particular block here sold for, I think, about 2,000 when it came up a couple of years ago. And it is a nice example. I believe it's also unmounted as well. It's probably one of the larger blocks unknown of this particular issue. And many omnibus collectors can only ever dream of affording one. It's not actually got a full listing in the catalogue because no examples were ever sent to Universal Postal Union. And so no perforated specimen examples of this stamp exist. And in part one, currently, it's priced at £850. So again, it's not one that's amazingly valuable, but it's still a nice stamp nonetheless. And I personally think that no 1946 Victory Omnibus set is complete without one of these. And I do enjoy seeing them from time to time when they appear on the market. And I think it's a great shame that stamp was never issued, because I think it's a very charming design and colour. But of course, one could completely understand why it wasn't issued, because of course the Malayan Union was not a success, and of course had to be dissolved very quickly after its inception. And of course, we move away now from the messy world of domestic and international politics and controversies as a result of a stamp issue. And in this part of the talk, we will examine the difficulties actually in printing a stamp, with delays due to lack of resources, waiting shipments, and other contributing factors that cause the withdrawal of a stamp. Then we'll briefly touch upon when a misunderstanding between a postmaster and printers caused the stamp to be withdrawn from use and never issued. And that's quite a fun story. And of course, this stamp might be familiar to some of you. It may not be familiar to others, but this is the very famous Indian stamp, the 9½ arches. It's 9½ arches because if you look on the far left and right of the stamp, there are 9½ arches in the design. It's a very important part, hence why I touched upon it first. The 9½ arches was actually meant to be the first all-Indian stamp issue. However, it was prepared for use and never issued. And this is the story why. The East India Company, which owned and administered India as a private enterprise still in the early 1850s, prior to 1857, after the Indian Mutiny, when it became a British Crown colony, set about establishing a postal service. The postal service currently in India at the time was very reminiscent of Great Britain's, say, 15 years prior, just before the introduction of the penny post system and of the issuing of stamps. And of course, there was one successful experiment for an all-Indian postal service, and that was in the Sindh province with the very famous Sindhork stamps, which were the small ringed seals of the East India Company that were used, but they were only valid within the Sindh province. And of course, the success of that experiment led the Indian government to want to establish a full postal service across the subcontinent. The government of India originally thought about introducing these issued stamps, but have them printed in London. However, the East India Company were absolutely adamant that the stamps had to be printed in India rather than the expense of them being printed elsewhere and then shipped halfway around the world. Original proposals saw a far different design. The task was passed to a gentleman called Colonel Forbes, and I'm going to touch briefly upon this because it's already a well-written subject, particularly if you're going to pick up say a copy of Dawson and the other Indian books of this time, which cover the introduction of the first issue of stamps. And also, there are very similar talks about this subject available on YouTube from other philatelists as well who've spoken on this subject, and some great articles as well. But to paraphrase the story, there's a gentleman called Colonel Forbes of the Stamp Office in Calcutta. He had to prepare a set of new stamps, and he decided to use the Moher coin, which depicted a lion rampant under a palm tree. And these are more commonly known as the lion and palm tree essays. Due to the laborious nature in replicating the design and printing the vast quantities required, Forbes estimated that he could print all the stamps that were required for him, but it would take in excess of a year to fulfill, and that was far longer than the East India Company were prepared to wait for a new design. The baton then was passed to Captain Thullier of the lithographic department. Now, lithography in the early 1850s was still a relatively new process and was top of the range in technology. He designed a far simpler stamp, reminiscent of the current penny reds that were being issued, and had a design engraved and printed onto lithographic stones. And these are, of course, the 9.5 arches design, as we see here, printed in an English vermilion color. And of course, this is the new design feature of the stamp having 9.5 arches. Captain Thullier, after I get the light again, Captain Thullier, as we were saying, then proceeded to print 900 sheets of these 9.5 arches, and they were dispatched to Bombay in readiness for their issue to the public. However, the vermilion ink supplies which he had to hand had been completely exhausted, and the shipment for this would take far longer to arrive. And so, of course, he then began experiments using blue indigo inks. When these trials proved satisfactory, he then produced an altered design, albeit with only 8 arches. It's very similar to the 9.5 arches, but only had 8 arches in the left and right-hand side columns. And he began to print these new half-anners in blue. The 9.5 arches, however, were never sold to the public and were kept in storage in Bombay for some time before they were destroyed. It was not until the early 20th century that examples of the 9.5 arches began to emerge onto the market, and a complete sheet was discovered in 1949 and has been subsequently broken up. Jal Cooper, eminent Indian philatelist and collector, writes quite a lot about the subject of the 9.5 arches in his book regarding classic Indian philately, and that's always a good read as well. I can recommend that to any India collector. And of course, the 9.5 arches is a great rarity, and many Indian collectors can only have a dream of owning one of these. And on average, depending on condition, these stamps generally run into the thousands of pounds in terms of value. Blocks of these stamps do carry large premiums, and I remember there was one that sold for £30,000, and that was a Lower Marlborough block of 6, and that is quite a hefty sum for just, say, one particular stamp, which in all realness is not particularly scarce, considering the whole sheet, which I think estimated about 360 individual stamps, because they were double sheets, had survived. And of course, the next story of a stamp that was prepared for use but never is probably one of the more fun stories in the world of philately. And this is the St. Helena, Edward VII, the all-red penny. And now, again, this is not a stamp many people might be familiar with, but I think it's a fun story. So, the misunderstanding was a result between the postmaster and the printers. In 1911, the postmaster St. Helena placed an order with the printers De La Rue for a supply of stamps to tide the island over until the new King George V stamps were ready to be issued. On the order form, the postmaster simply placed 1D red, and De La Rue, rather than reprint the previous 1903 bi-coloured issue, which they had done previously for Edward VII, which is where the central part of the design, the central vignette, was in black and the frame was in red, decided to proceed with printing a monocoloured design, very reminiscent of the Tyrian plum, which we spoke about earlier, to create this, thus creating an all-red penny. De La Rue were not in the habit, I will just put it out there now, De La Rue were not in the habit of making mistakes, and generally have a spotless record of production of stamps. And of course, they have also got very few attributed errors, except for inverted centers and a couple of errors of color. But of course, De La Rue did exactly what was asked for them. They printed a 1-penny red. The stamps were distributed to Universal Post Unit as per convention and practice, and then the whole stocks of the unoverprinted stamps were sent out to St. Helena. Again, there's a big theme as you were going on through this talk where the stamps are still arriving, but they are kept in the archives, and that's how many of them survive and come onto the market. One can only imagine the postmaster's annoyance upon receiving these vast stocks of this penny red stamp that he had not ordered. And no one really quite knows the full ins and outs story from there, other than the stamps were destroyed. I'm assuming there must be some record somewhere of the conversations between De La Rue and the postmasters regarding this, but I think they may be lost to the sands of time. And the stamps were therefore destroyed, and only the specimen overprinted examples survive. The stamp is relatively scarce, and I've not really handled that many in my career. And this particular example here was sold last year in our Eagle South Atlantic sale, which was all things British South Atlantic, from Falkland Islands, St. Helena, Tristan da Cunha, and the Falkland Island dependencies, and so on. And currently, it's not an expensive stamp either, because of course they had to be sent out to all UPU members countries. So there are a fair few that are out there. And currently, in the Part 1 catalogue, it's priced at £425. So again, it's probably one of the more cheaper examples of stamps that were issued. But I think it's quite a funny story that De La Rue and the postmaster got into such a tizzy about this stamp that they ended up having to set it on fire. But thankfully, the UPU archive members kept their versions, and when those archives began to be broken up and sold, they came on the philatelic market for us philatelists to appreciate and enjoy. And of course, the last ones we're going to talk about today are due to external forces. A monarch hadn't died or abdicated. There was no political controversies, and there was no misunderstandings either. It was all due to a ship sinking. So these ones are from the Falkland Islands. In 1891, a further printing of the halfpenny and twopenny halfpennies were requested by the postmasters, and Bradbury Wilkins duly printed them and shipped them to the Falkland Islands. However, fate intervened, and the stamps never reached the Falkland Islands, as the ship called the Necco, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, sank off the coast of France, and all the supplies of the May 1891 printing were lost. These stamps are still technically classed as prepared for use, but never issued, albeit it was not due to the death of a monarch, or political controversy, or lack of resources, or even down to a misunderstanding. It was the age-old enemy, the sea, and a slightly leaking vessel. And whilst these stamps, I would hope, continue to sleep with the fishes down in the Atlantic, Bradbury Wilkinson, however, kept an archive sheet of each value of 60. So 60 examples of each value still exist on the market today. The loss of the shipment, however, led to an elongated lead time in the production of new stamps. So it would take some weeks and months. And so the postmasters had to get creative, and down in the Falkland Islands, they began to bisect and provisionally bisect a lot of the stamps and hand stamp them with halfpenny to cover themselves and tide them over. Hence why in the Falkland Islands you have the various penny values, which were vertically and diagonally bisected and then hand stamped halfpenny to therefore tide themselves over until the new halfpenny and twopenny halfpenny values arrived. And of course, if these stamps had arrived, we wouldn't have had this wonderful, unique element from the Falkland Islands that the collectors enjoy now. But of course, touching upon the archive examples, the sheets of 60, which still survive, came onto the market and then, of course, were broken up predominantly into singles. Some blocks of these do survive, and they are distinguishable by their shade colours. And these are taken from the Stefan Heitz catalogue listings. They are not listed in the Stanley Gibbons catalogues, but they are listed by Stefan Heitz, who is a very eminent collector in the Falkland Islands. And what he doesn't know about the Falkland Islands is probably not worth knowing. And he has also published his own specialised catalogue listings for the Falkland Islands. And that's a very good read as well, if anyone is out there who really wants to take the Falkland Islands to the next level, so to speak. In the Heitz catalogue, they have the colour for classifications of halfpenny in blue-green and the twopenny halfpenny in the rather long-winded colour description of very pale chalky ultramarine, which is a bit of a mouthful to say. As I was saying, they are not listed in the Stanley Gibbons catalogue, as no examples were sent on to UPU member states from that particular printing. and they are currently priced in the Heights catalogue at £1,000 each. And a note to collectors as well that the archive sheets of stamps are known with little to no trace of gum. I can't say I've handled one of these in recent times, but they do come along every now and again in certain other auction houses, and hopefully in ours at some time in the future. But they really do offer a sort of, again, what might have been in the Falkland Islands philately, but also in a way, I'm quite glad they got sank and never quite reached the Falkland Islands, because then we wouldn't have had all those wonderful bisects to deal with, and they are good fun as well, albeit a challenge to the philatelist. I believe really, as we bring this talk to its close, that we've only just touched the tip of the iceberg with regards to the many hundreds of other stamps that were prepared for use and never issued. There are many others I could have touched upon in this talk. Honourable mentions include the Ceylon 24-cent brown purple and some of the other Queen Elizabeth II ones that never quite made it as well. And there's a wonderful article in the Postal Museum's website talking about some Queen Elizabeth II stamps that never quite made it to the issue stage, whether by error of design, slight change of design, change in postal rates. And again, it's a good read as well. And if you can see them in the Postal Museum whenever they're on display, that's always fun to do as well. But I think I shall have to bring this talk to its close. Otherwise, we'll be here too long, and I'll have to come back another day and to talk about more stamps that are prepared for use but never issued. In this talk, we've explored the many reasons why a stamp was prepared for use but never issued, whether it be a change of monarch, the political situation, lack of resources, a sinking ship, and even a simple misunderstanding between printer and postmaster. And I think the overriding feature in this talk, other than me drooling on for some time, is that no matter how hard officials try, someone will always save one of these stamps, whether it be from pulling them out of the furnaces, just keeping one aside, or simply just a slight little bit of theft. Just only minor, but it does help if you're a member of the aristocracy and are very well connected in government. I hope that the viewers at home have perhaps learned something and may now to seek out one of these prepared for use but never issued stamps and add them to their own collections. I know which one I would go for if money was no object. And I thank you again for sitting through this talk, and I thank the PTS for inviting me again to speak at Virtual Stampex, and I shall have to now go away and think of something else to talk about for next time.
There are more Virtual Stampex talks coming to YouTube. You know what to do. Click subscribe now so you don't miss out. See you soon. We hope to see you at our next Stampex show, at Virtual Stampex or in person in London.